All right, we just talked about what federation looks like, kind of the high level stuff. We can stretch networks, we can do security across multiple locations. We've got some cool stuff, but before we can use those cool features, how do we make it go? How do we bring it all together? How do we deploy federation and onboard our existing locations? Well, that's what we're going to talk about here. It's everything we're going to talk about here. So, before we get into federation, before we dive into what we've got going on, let's pause for a second and think about what we need before we dive in. I have to think about my location-to-location latency. Usually that's going to be about 150 milliseconds. Unless all I'm doing is security. If all I'm using federation for is security, to share firewall rules and to program firewall rules across multiple locations, if the only thing I'm doing is security, I can get away with up to 500 milliseconds between locations. But the minute I start to even think about stretched networking, then my latency barrier drops back to 150 milliseconds. We've got to think about that. We've got to be aware of that. And we've got to make sure we control that. We naturally are going to very, very strongly desire a 1700 byte MTU across my WAN. That could be a little bit challenging simply because the WAN is one of the places we generally carry the least control in our infrastructures. We want to minimize that idea of a small MTU here. We want to keep this at a 1700 byte MTU or larger because we don't want our overlay packets to fragment as they're going from one location to another. One of the things we're doing here with federation is we're stretching overlay segments from location to location across sites. Well, that means there's Geneve involved. Let's not force a fragmentation of those packets from location to location. We just don't want fragmentation. And we also recommend, no congestion for our management or data plane. What does that even mean? Well, that means it's going to be very specific to you, your infrastructure, your WAN links, what you have going on. Is a gigabit link going to be enough? Is a 500 megabit link going to be enough? I don't know. And you may not know until you sit down and think about it and talk about it and figure out what kind of pipe you need between your different locations. Your data plane, when we talk about your data plane, we need to think about things like public IP addresses that may need to be advertised through, not necessarily even through NSX, but, we're talking NSX, so let's leave it in that context. If I'm advertising public IP addresses from NSX, can I advertise that IP address from location A or location B or location C? Depending on who owns the IP address, that may be easier in some cases than others. I need to think about this ahead of time if I've got multiple locations. And this is going to make version compatibility a little bit of a bigger deal, right? If I set up federation, then all of my infrastructure, all of my locations need to be running the same version of NSX, which means now I have to plan a little more carefully for version upgrades because I've got to get everything upgraded together. Right. So we want to think about that. And even if we're just getting into this, I need to make sure that all of my locations are on the same version now, right? If I'm on 4.0.1, then all of my locations need to be 4.0.1 before I bring them all into federation. So we've got to think about versioning. There are a number of things just to watch for as we are looking at this. Now, let's say that we have all of those things under control. We've gone through our little checklist. We say, okay, everything's good. We want to do this. What are we going to do? How are we going to walk through that process? Well, first things first, we're going to deploy and configure our global manager in what we call our active site. Well, what does that mean, our active site? That just means that I want my global manager cluster set up someplace where it's going to run as my active global manager cluster. Then I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to set up a standby global manager site. In other words, if my active global manager data center, if the entire site goes away, I have a standby that I can fail over to. Well, I need to set those things up, and I want to set those things up first. Once I set up my standby global manager cluster, then I can log back into my active global manager and start installing or adding my local managers. Remember, we can have up to 8 of them, but I can add my local managers to my global manager at that point. And depending on whether or not I'm worried about location-to-location traffic, right, stretched networking, I may even configure my RTEPs, my remote tunnel endpoints. Once all that's done, my infrastructure is considered installed and onboarded, but my locations are not considered onboarded necessarily. Onboarding my locations consists of importing policies and objects from the local manager to global manager. If you remember from the last video, global manager just tells local manager about stuff. It doesn't listen to global manager about much of anything. Well, we have one opportunity for that, and that's in this location onboarding process where we can import those local objects into global manager so that maybe I can just start managing everything globally. So once I have my global manager deployed, right, I've deployed the virtual appliance. I can log into the virtual appliance, and under the System tab, I can go to my locations or my location manager. And in that, I have to make this location active, right? Just because I've deployed a global manager doesn't mean it's active, it's standby or anything. I have to go in and define that. So here we're going to define an active global manager. We'll hit the big Make Active link, and we'll be prompted for a name for this global manager, and we'll go ahead and save that, and poof, there we go. We will have an active global manager cluster. It may only have one node like we show here, but we have that active global manager cluster. We really want to have 3 nodes in our global manager cluster. Right? That's what we want. We want that for high availability. But here, just as an example, we have a single node active manager cluster. Then we can look to our right on the in the UI, and we see the big button that says let's set up a standby global manager cluster. And hopefully at this point I've got my standby global manager appliances deployed. If not, I want to do that real quick and then come back here and set my my standby global manager. And we're going to set that, and here we have our add standby global manager UI. And we ask for, the FQDN and credentials and a certificate thumbprint for the target global manager. Now, we're not going to discover the target thumbprint. I have to have access to that standby global manager, and I have to be able to run the command get certificate API thumbprint. And that thumbprint that's displayed is going to need to be copied and pasted. I hope it's copied and pasted. I don't want to have to type that. Copied and pasted into the certificate thumbprint in the UI. Right. Once we can do that, we want to run the compatibility check. The save button will not light up until we run the compatibility check, which is going to validate more than anything version compatibility. So we'll run the compatibility check, then we'll go ahead and save the configuration once it passes. Then I have my standby. Below that, we can see our on-prem location. So if I want to start adding my local managers now, well, I can do that. I can hit the add on-prem location, and I see a wizard that looks just like the add a standby global manager wizard, asking me for the FQDN of my local manager and credentials and the certificate thumbprint, which I also need to have access to the local manager to run that same get certificate API thumbprint command and copy and paste that into the thumbprint. I have to run the same compatibility check, and then I can add that in. And I'm going to repeat this process for up to my 8 local managers, my 8 different locations. Once that's all done, well, then I can go do some validation. One of the big ways I'm going to do some validation is actually up in the menu bar of the Global Manager UI. Right? Once I start adding locations, then we'll have our location drop down up at the top bar of the screen where I can pull that menu down and I can select any individual location to go look at. And that's going to essentially pull up the local manager UI, more or less. I'm still in Global Manager, but I'm managing things on the local manager. And I can, in the System tab, go look at my Location Manager. I can see information about this local manager and see what global managers are associated. Here I can see latency statistics between a given global manager, or a given local manager rather, and its global managers, right, active and standby. So we can see a lot of really cool stuff here. So this is how we're going to do a lot of validation of our infrastructure onboarding. And then we can start going through the location onboarding. And this is where we're going to say, hey, let's go ahead and add these objects in, right? Import these objects, and we can prefix them with some kind of string. We can choose, we can see what will be imported and all that kind of stuff. And so, here we kind of see some of that as we are preparing for onboarding. Hey, we found these objects. We want to define them in Global Manager with this object name prefix. So, let's keep moving forward. Let's do it. And then we can start to see these things as the process completes. As we go and start looking at the local manager UI on my different local managers, we'll start to see the local objects. But we'll also see that they have a GM badge next to them that says now these objects are owned by Global Manager. Now, just because we import things into Global Manager, let's not confuse things. These objects are not stretched at this point, right? We've imported a tier 0 gateway. We've imported some groups, but those groups are still specific to that location, to site B in this example. But now that these objects are owned by Global Manager, I could go in and reconfigure them to span multiple locations if that's something I desired. So the installation, the onboarding process for Global Manager, it's pretty straightforward, I think. It's worth it to remember that I need get certificate API thumbprint as a command on easily accessible on my keyboard. I need to remember that. It's going to come out every time I want to onboard a new standby location or a new on-prem location, my local managers. We're not going to discover the thumbprint when we get there. So I want to watch for that. I want to remember that. But when it comes down to it, onboarding locations into NSX is pretty simple, right? Into Federation. So come back in the next video. We'll start talking about networking, and then we'll wrap it all up talking about federated security after that. I can't wait to see you there.